This is Support is Sexy, episode 459, with Ellie Hearne, founder of Pencil or Ink Consulting. Welcome to Support is Sexy. I'm your host, Elaine Fluker, entrepreneur, author, and founder of Chic Rebellion Media. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, I bring you inspiring women entrepreneurs who share their wins and lessons to help you take your business to the next level. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Support is Sexy. I'm excited to have you here. It just would not be the same without you. And if you are a woman entrepreneur and you're ready to get your message out there, you're ready to share your expertise with the world, I want you to consider podcast guesting. And if you want to know how to be an unforgettable podcast guest, just download my free guide at girlonpodcastgift.com. That's girlonpodcastgift.com. Learn how to be an unforgettable podcast guest for all the right reasons. Now, today I am super excited to talk to our guest, Ellie Hearne. Ellie is the founder of Pencil or Ink Consulting. She has expertise in the space of communications, and I was fascinated to talk to her not only because of her beautiful website and the great clients that she's worked with and her expertise, but also because communications consulting is something that I've been doing a lot more of. So it was great to talk to someone else in that field who has expertise in that field. And we don't often think about how much communications plays a role in all of our businesses, not just if you're a communications company or a communications consultant. Communications is at the core of what we all do. So in this episode, I talked to Ellie about how business is personal, also something that she calls her platinum rule. So make sure to listen out for that. We talk about the importance of active listening, how to grow your consultancy business. So if you're a consultant, make sure you listen out for that. Also, Ellie talks about how a lighter touch and a shorter note is sometimes best. And ladies, don't be apologetic about being ambitious. Love that. So I know you're going to love this episode. So without further ado, Ellie Hearne. So Ellie, thank you so much for joining us for an episode of Support is Sexy. I'm excited to chat with you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me, Elaine.
Of course. My pleasure. So our first question, when did you first fall in love with entrepreneurship?
I would say that I had about 6 months of entrepreneurship under my belt before I thought, this is it. This is what I love doing. I'm so glad I made this decision. I started out working in more traditional sort of office roles where I was employed, where I had benefits and everything else. And after I had a baby, I went back to my old company after maternity leave. And for me, it was just too soon. I grew up in Europe and I think I was just a little bit more accustomed to having longer leave. Over there, it's more like a year.
A year, right.
So after a few weeks of that, I decided to leave and I parted from my company on great terms, which was great. They were so understanding. But after being at home with my wonderful daughter when she was a little over a year, I knew I was ready to go back to work and I wanted to use a different part of my brain again. It was actually, I had been freelancing a little bit and one of my freelance clients said, why don't you just start your own business? That was it for me. I started out doing various little bits of freelancing, but then got a website and named my company and started to put it all together from there. And I would say with a few months of doing that behind me, I realized, oh my goodness, I can't imagine it any other way. This is the perfect fit for me. And now it's a full-time job.
Right. Now, did you have any fear after you had your daughter, went back to work and then decided, you know what, I'm going to leave for however long, maybe you didn't know how long it was going to be at that time. Did you have any fear or concern about leaving the workforce? And I ask that for women listening who either are in that situation or have been there in some ways. Maybe because you grew up in Europe, you didn't, it's going to be okay. But growing up in the US, there's this sort of fear of, I have to get back after a month or 3 months or, the whole thing's going to fall apart.
Yes, I did. I had that fear before I went back to my old job. And I think a lot of women do.
Mm-hmm.
There's some survey, I can find the right one so you can link to it.
Great.
But essentially at 3 months, 90% of American women aren't ready to go back to work. But at 12 months, it flips. 90% of women are ready to go back. So the system here is sort of set against us without being too dramatic, just in terms of we're not really ready. Our babies probably need us if we're nursing, especially. And, that's a whole other podcast. There's a lot of pressure to do that.
Right.
But you've got to pay the bills. And I would say one thing I want to emphasize about my entrepreneurship journey is I want to acknowledge the privilege I had. Like, not every woman can step away from work. So I definitely had fear about my career in terms of taking time out. But I also knew that I was lucky to be able to do that. And I think it was more when I'd been home for, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, as that started to rack up behind me. I thought, oh my goodness, I have put my career on hold. It's not just being away from the office and being away from the career ladder. It's things like 401k contributions, like all these other things start to add up the longer you stay away. So I definitely had the fear. I think in our own minds, as people, never mind just women, it can feel much bigger and scarier and bigger to us, that sort of gap in our resume, than it is for the workforce. Like often, I'll meet women who are terrified to go back to work because they say, oh, I've got this big gap on my resume. But at the end of the day, depending on your field, of course, but if you have the right experiences, the right skills, and you learn a lot being a mom too, I don't want to discount that. But if you have all those things going for you, many, many companies would be thrilled to have you. And I think there's a lot of untapped talent out there kind of waiting at home. And we really need to encourage each other as women, if we want to, because everyone's different, but to encourage each other to get back to work if that's the right thing for us, and not to let that sort of fear hold us back.
Excellent. Ellie, thank you so much for sharing your story too, that part of your story, I should say, and being honest about that fear that a lot of us face for so many different reasons. As you mentioned, sometimes we feel like the system, is set up to make us afraid, but thank you so much for sharing how you got through that. And as you mentioned, for you, there was a certain level of privilege that you had being able to leave that other women might not have, but still, just for everyone listening to be able to think it through and know that it's possible and that there are other options for you. And that, like you said, that gap on your resume doesn't discredit all the work and experience you've done before that gap, right? Sometimes we think people are only going to see that gap. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Of course. I think that gap, it's definitely bigger in our own minds. But one thing that really resonated with me was I was part of a mommy group, as many new moms are. And the mom who started it, who in herself is amazing, she's got 3 boys under 4. So I think she deserves all the Exactly. She was talking about stay-at-home dads, and obviously that's kind of a rare species in the US especially. But she was saying one thing that stood out to her when she spoke to these guys is they have no fear about going back to work, or if they do, they don't really talk about it. I think that's interesting and that's instructive, and I sort of used that as a motivator for myself. Like, this can be as big a monster as we make it in our own minds, but if you just focus on what you can do, the skills that you have, they don't go away. Various things change a little bit about your work-life balance, but you're still, if you were good before, you're good after you have a kid when it comes to the workplace. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind.
Right. Excellent. Now, you mentioned that you grew up in Europe. Where did you grow up?
I was born in Ireland, in Dublin, and I grew up in Scotland. So the UK was my home for a very long time before I came to New York City.
What would you say a young Ellie was like growing up in Ireland and Scotland?
Very shy, not at all confident. I think on some level I was always ambitious, and this will sound quite negative, but I sort of knew I always wanted to leave. And I think a lot of people growing up in small towns might feel that way. So I did have ambitions, but I was never too public about them. I knew my parents both worked. They worked for businesses. My dad actually worked for a couple of different American companies, and my mom was a business person in her own right. And I think in that way that you only realize when you're growing up what a big influence your upbringing has on you. I'm now looking back, I realize, I always pictured myself working hard and being ambitious. I just didn't really know it at the time.
Was the fact that someone sort of planted that seed about you becoming an entrepreneur, because you said before that you were sort of, I guess, freelancing or consulting with different people once you decided to leave and then get back into sort of the workforce in your own way. Was someone planting that seed for you of why don't you just start your own business a clear turning point for you?
I think so. And I think a lot of the women I met when I was on maternity leave, had a big impact on me too. Like I got involved with, it actually started out as a yoga studio, this little organization in New York City where they did prenatal and postnatal yoga. It's called Love Child. If you're in the city, check it out. It, started out doing this very kind of yoga focused work in terms of new moms and pregnant women. And the person who started it, Nilu, became a friend of mine. And she was asking for my advice, which did a couple of things. One, it sort of reminded me that I am a communications expert and I have those skills, even though I was, nursing and changing diapers all day.
Mm-hmm.
And she asked for my advice about her communications, and I gave her a lot of it. And I actually ended up volunteering when they expanded from just being a yoga studio into a support space for new moms and expecting women and even people who are having fertility issues. And it's also not confined to one particular gender. It's a very open and welcoming space. That exposed me to a lot of women who were going through this massive change in terms of becoming moms, but also New York City being what it is, we're also very much career women. And that just made for a lot of interesting conversations, and it really inspired me a lot.
So what would you say was the deciding factor for you in naming your company Pencil or Ink, which I love? And I told Ellie before we started that I love her website. So everyone will have a link to that. Just the design and everything, the whole brand is just beautiful. What made you just call it Pencil or Ink?
Thank you. Well, I wanted something that acknowledged the communications angle. Like, as I'm sure we'll talk about, I do a few different things like coaching and facilitations and more strategic communications work. But for me, the common thread of all those things is communication. And I actually very early in my career started out as an editor. So I've always loved writing and words. And I guess a more superficial note, I also love stationery and nice paper and pens. So that was a big part of it. But I would say the main factor to answer your question, and I'm sure this will resonate with more than a few of your listeners, is the domain pencilerink.com was available.
Oh my gosh. That's like the number one thing. That's the first thing you do when you get an idea now, right? It's like, let me just see, start typing in on your phone or the computer. Is this available? Yep.
Exactly. Is the Instagram available?
Exactly. Can
all
this
of
be
these
across
things.
all platforms? You're such an entrepreneur. That's so true. I love it. Now, you mentioned that you were an editor before, and now, as you mentioned, your business is all about communications in different ways. It's funny, I was an editor for many years, a writer and still a writer, but an editor for many years, and now do a lot of consulting in communications. And before I started, I didn't think of how those skills were so transferable of being an editor and a writer and then doing things in communications and strategy. So was it when you started working with the lady at the yoga studio, did you sort of get a sense of just how transferable a lot of your editing skills were, or were you already doing communications consulting with other people at that point?
I was already doing it, but I had a similar realization to what you had in terms of how those skills would help me. It just came a little bit earlier than when I became a mom and was at the yoga studio. I started out in a nonprofit as an editorial assistant. My master's is in international relations, so that was the right fit for me at the time. But it was really the communications piece rather than the international development or international relations piece that really stayed with me. And when I kind of moved on through my career and started working in the private sector versus the nonprofits, I realized, oh, wait a minute, these skills, while very transferable, aren't that common necessarily. I don't know if you found this, Elaine, but
Yes.
I remember being amazed, without sounding harsh, but I remember being amazed at how many people were so successful but weren't the best writers or weren't good at self-editing, and then just feeling very fortunate that I'd had the chance to learn this and to take it with me. And I would say even now, everything that I do, is supported by and underpinned by those things I learned early on, even if I think, like a lot of people, my career path didn't feel very, sort of buttoned up and strategic in the way that looking back, it probably appears on the outside.
Right. Yeah, they call it the curse of knowledge, where we think everyone knows how to do whatever our specialty is, right? But it's like, actually, everyone doesn't, or people don't want to do that. They want someone who's an expert at that. So for everyone listening, don't forget that. Don't think that, well, everyone knows how to do whatever this is. That might be your gem in there.
That's so true. Like, I see that a lot in my work as well. Like, people take for granted their skill set and say, well, no one would pay me to do this, or I'm stuck in this company, when really, to your point, there's just a world of possibility out there.
Now, Pencil or Ink, would you call it a leadership communications firm? That's what
That's
I
right.
think. Okay. So now tell us why communications is an important part of organizations of every size, and then how it translates into different parts of our businesses.
Communications impacts everything. And the examples that are top of mind for me at the moment is things like an email sent in haste, even at a big company, can, ruin someone's day or rub them the wrong way, or, best case, it makes the person who sent it just look a little bit less polished.
Mm-hmm.
It can impact, not just those sort of day-to-day things and, how we each talk to each other and interact, but also on a much bigger kind of strategic level, how your company is perceived and the work that you do every day lands with people if you're not communicating well. So really, from the individual startup founder to the, Fortune 500 CEO or CMO or whoever, it just impacts every single facet of what an organization does.
Do you find that more organizations, whether it's smaller or larger, are starting to pay more attention to communications, which sometimes they call soft skills or other ways of phrasing it, but really it comes down to communications? Do you find that companies are starting to become more aware of how important that is?
Yes, I think so. I've been seeing a trend towards that, particularly in industries that, to put it bluntly, that can afford it. So if you look at, tech, pharmaceuticals, finance, they often are very quick to bring in third parties to help them with their communications. But what I'm seeing on a more kind of human level is increasingly smaller businesses and smaller startups are getting help with their communications early on. And it may be that they start by bringing in a PR or marketing expert because of course, their first priority is to make some money and, pay those bills that have been racking up. But also, as those companies begin to grow, they realize, wait a minute, we need to look inward a little bit. And as we scale our culture, how do we make sure that we maintain all the great things about how we work with each other that we had when it was just two people in a room, or that hopefully we had when it was just two people in a room? So more and more people are recognizing that. And I think there's also, I've talked a little bit about consultants coming in, but also people are learners and they're willing to, buy that business book or listen to that podcast like this one,
Mm-hmm.
or read the Harvard Business Review and think, how can I get better at communicating? How can I manage my team better? All these things that often are afterthoughts if you didn't start out as an editor. But as a company grows or as somebody gets promoted into a leadership role at a bigger company, I think they often have this realization, I'm in this role not because I'm great at communicating and giving feedback and talking about what I do, but because I'm very good at delivering on a particular set of tasks and I have a different set of skills. So maybe I do need to get a little bit better at the soft skills, the communication side.
I think, too, it's important that you mention this is whether you are a startup or whether you have a role in a particular company, communications can still has a place, I should say. It's not just even though we're talking to women entrepreneurs, but it's not just if you're in that space, also how you communicate in whatever position you're in, right? It goes beyond the organization. It matters to the individual as well.
That's very true. It's not just the kind of big picture, strategic level stuff that's in the planning meetings. It's every day. It's how individuals interact. It's how we, someone outside of work asks what you do. Sometimes that's the hardest question to answer, but it comes up for everyone. I sometimes say to people, especially if they're working on a complicated app or product, I say, how would you tell your grandmother or grandfather about this? Like, how would you break this down?
That's a good question.
Sometimes that's the best way to make it accessible. And often they end up using that, which is kind of funny, really, but it's a good example.
So when a client comes to you, what are they looking to accomplish in their business?
I would say the overarching thing is they want to get better. And so often that involves not necessarily taking a particular class or getting accredited in something, but it involves communications. And for my business, that means 3 different approaches. One is the individual coaching and consulting, and that could mean, a coaching session is different for every coachee. People are different and they have different needs. But for me, again, communications, I love the rule of 3s. Coaching can mean learning a skill, like getting better at delegating, for example, or getting better at presenting your ideas to a room, sort of executive presence skills, physical communication skills. But beyond skills, it can also mean workshopping a particular challenge. Like, what do you do when life happens? happens? What do you do when you have a weird interaction with someone and you want to just bounce it off, or a third party who isn't part of your workplace bubble? It can also mean career or company development. Like maybe you have a plan, or maybe you don't and you feel like you should. Maybe that's a conversation that you can have with your coach. Maybe you have a career plan, but you're not really sure what that looks like this week. Maybe you've got your 5-year plan, but what are you going to do in the next months to execute on that? That's 3 of the things that coaching can touch on: the skills, the workshopping challenges, and the career and company stuff if you're a small business or startup. Beyond coaching, we also do strategic communications work, and that could be putting together an elevator pitch or a really good slide deck presentation for investors, or if you're already a large established company, putting together a strong presentation to roll out a new initiative internally or maybe externally. It could mean writing a speech for a keynote address. It could mean putting together content, talking points for a panel discussion. It can really mean a lot of different things. Sometimes we'll put together a whole communications plan for an organization and help them execute on each piece of it, or we'll coach them so that they can execute on each piece of it, or most often it's somewhere in the middle. And then the third thing after the coaching and the strategic communications work is group workshops and facilitations. And that's what it sounds like, working together as a group with a team, a company, a small business, and spending an afternoon or even 2 hours with them. It used to be a full day or 2 days, but very few people have time for that anymore. But working on particular skills, any of the stuff I've mentioned, presentation skills, content skills, how to lead better, these skills that we often, if we thought about it and spent some time, we could probably get better on our own, but who has the time for that? So bringing someone to help coach you and give you feedback and help you get better in a very short space of time. And then we also, as part of that, do workshop facilitation. Like people might bring us in to help run their offsite and move the conversation forward. As a third party, often you can have those difficult conversations and make it, I always say business is personal, but make it more palatable and sometimes fun for everyone. So really get the discussion moving forward.
What do you mean by that phrase, business is personal? I love that.
It can mean so many things, right? I think it means different things to different people. But for me, it just means that when you make a business decision or you have a business conversation or you send a work email to someone, there's a human being on the other side of that, or sometimes a whole group or a whole team, or in the case of some of our larger clients, many thousands of employees around the world receiving that and picking it up. And you have to bear in mind the context for those people. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe the email was sent in a rush. Maybe they, although if you work with us, hopefully it wasn't, or maybe, when you have those feedback conversations with your staff, you're thinking, very much about the business objectives and kind of getting them to perform better because it's good for the company and you think it will be good for their career. But as they're receiving that, maybe all they're hearing is the criticism. And as a result, it's not really landing well, or they're not hearing the compliment that you paid them, because everyone's a little bit different in how they receive feedback. So with everything that we do, I think this idea that business is personal just comes back again and again.
I love that. Thank you. I think one of the things that resonated for me was this idea of empathy, a conversation I've been having with a lot of people, a subject I've been discussing with a lot of people lately. But just sometimes I think empathy is lost in business. We don't, as you mentioned, think there's another human being on the other side of this communication. I think especially because not many of us talk to our colleagues on the phone as much anymore, or sometimes we're not even in the same space anymore. So this idea of being empathetic, especially when you are having a difficult conversation or sharing news that might be difficult or talking about some change, whatever it is, right? Do you think that is empathy something that you have as part of what you, even if not directly saying that, you teach to people that you're working with, your clients?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I agree with so much of what you're saying. I think empathy is often an afterthought, and it's not necessarily that the person is selfish or they don't care. It's more people are busy and they just don't think of it, or they assume the golden rule of treat people how you want to be treated is true, when really you have to think more these days about the platinum rule, like not how would I want to be treated, but how does that person actually want to be treated?
Oh, the platinum rule. Never heard of that, Ellie.
That's another good one.
I know, it's great.
You have to think, well, what does this person want? Like maybe when someone gives me feedback, I like them to get right to the point and just tell me what I'm doing wrong so I can get better. Whereas another person may want to hear what they're doing right first, and they won't listen to the more critical feedback until they've heard that. And it's almost a 50-50 split in terms of how people go on that one, incidentally. But yes, we do talk a lot about empathy. And we may not necessarily use the word empathy, but it's there. It's like the water that we're swimming in. It's everywhere.
I always try to start with what's working. I don't know, but that might just be me thinking about, maybe I'm thinking of the golden rule. I need to think of the platinum rule, but I always start with what's working and then talk about what we can do better.
Maybe. And I feel like that's a good default when you don't, especially
You're not
like
sure.
coming in as a consultant. Yeah, when you're not sure. But I think if you're working with people for a longer time or coaching your team, I'm saying you're, but it could be anyone's. When you're coaching your own team, you need to have those conversations, like not just what do you want to achieve professionally, but how do you like to receive feedback, or what motivates you, what helps you when you're doing your job. And that will, as a leader, as a boss, sort of help you get even better at coaching that person.
Let's talk about that for a second. You sort of mentioned when you, as a consultant, because a lot of women listening are consultants or coaches and work with different companies or organizations. When you go into a company or organization before before they're even fully clear of what you're going to offer them, or maybe they have an idea, but they haven't experienced you, for lack of a better word, isn't it important not to go in with, these are all the changes we're going to make, or how do you approach it? In other words, since we're talking about the platinum rule, organizations think when a consultant comes in, some people are afraid because they think this means everything's going to change or they're going to hear about all the things they're doing wrong. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, because you do, as a third party, have this hurdle of, maybe one or two people here really like me and like what I have to say, and that's what I'm in the room. But then there's all these sort of unknowns sitting around.
People kind of giving you the side eye, like, why is she here?
They're like, are you going to take my job? I mean, over time, it often evolves into, oh, these people kind of get it now, and they get that I can help them and make their job easier. But it is a big barrier to overcome. I would say in terms of communications, a couple of things are evergreen. People love when you make good use of their time, and they love to be listened to. And I think if you bear those things in mind, and I think the kind of third one that's almost unspoken is this idea of respect. If you have respect for the people, if you plan things well, and again, that gets back to making good use of their time and being respectful, then people tend to appreciate that. And a good example is when you kick off your meeting, first of all, kind of open it with, here's why we're here, just kind of level set. Hopefully you sent an agenda or a loose plan in advance, but let's just assume people are busy and they don't have time to look at it, because that's often the case. Run through what the goals are, and then say, but what do you guys think? How do you want to spend the next hour or the next 30 minutes? What do you want to make sure we want to cover? And find your own way to ask, but keep it a nice, open question that gets people into this mindset of, oh, this is an interactive meeting.
Right.
This is
collaborative.
Exactly. And they will start to feel ownership of the whole process that will hopefully follow if you get the business, which I'm sure you all will. And that in itself can make a really big difference. Just having that respect for people, giving them the chance to speak up, and not just saying, does that sound okay? Because that's a yes/no question, and they will either say yes or no, and you probably won't learn a whole lot more. But really interview them, let them speak, show them that you can listen. That in itself makes a really big difference. And then people start to realize, oh, I'm not just being pitched at. This person actually wants to hear what I have to say. This is a conversation. Maybe I can work with this person.
Do you find that in some ways, not repeating but saying something, what I've done in the past is say things like, this is what I hear you saying, and this is what what I think about it, or later, whatever the strategy is around that. But like you said, I think too, that people want to know that they've been heard.
Exactly. So I use those I call them playbacks or paraphrases. I use those all the time, and I coach people to use them. I think active listening is the most underused skill that we all have in our toolkit. And it can get you really far. I mean, at a minimum, as you know, Elaine, it reduces misunderstanding because you give everyone the chance to correct what you've heard. But also, people love to be listened to. I like to say it's why we love therapists and hairdressers and bartenders, right. All these professions where people listen to you. And beyond that, when you have a interesting or intense experience, the first thing you probably do is tell a friend or a loved one, because you want to be listened to, you want to be heard. And the next sort of piece of that I use when I'm coaching people on listening is this idea of, and how frustrating is it in those little examples when you tell your friend something, when they take over your story, or when they jump in to tell you about the crazy thing that happened to them when they were in a similar situation. So just being cognizant of that and giving other people the chance to speak is really so important.
Now, something I noticed on the Pencil or Ink website is that you're an accredited provider of insights discovery. So what is insights discovery, and how does that work in terms of communications?
So insights discovery, which I should probably communicate better on my website about what it is. It sounds a little, space agey.
No, it's intriguing.
So it's essentially personality profiling. So if you're familiar with any of these, like Myers-Briggs or Enneagram, it's like that. There are a few reasons I favor it over the other tests. Number one is it's constantly being updated. It's very thoroughly researched. The company that does it has been around for 20 to 30 years at this point. And even though they've been doing it for that long, they don't rest on their laurels. They're always updating it. They translate it into different languages quite frequently. And when they do, sometimes they go back and tweak some of the words in the initial evaluator that people take to get their personality profiles. But it's also very, very useful for businesses. And unlike some personality tests, and I won't name names, it doesn't say you are a green and therefore you are always like this. These are the mistakes you make and this is how it goes for you, which can be quite limiting. It says your kind of main personality set of traits, and they use colors, are blue, followed by yellow, followed by green, followed by red, or whatever it is. But you have all four colors, you have all four personality types within you. It's just about how you show up in different situations. So there's a lot of room in there for coaching. There's a lot of room in there for self-awareness, which then sort of leads to being more aware of others. For example, I find it very easy to listen to people, but I find it more challenging to be quick thinking and action oriented. So I just have to work harder at that. It's not saying that you can't do it. It's just saying you have to, put a little bit more conscious energy or thought into it, for example. So long story short, it's a personality profile, but there's a lot of room in it for coaching and development, which I think is really important.
When I was looking at the different colors and the characteristics, I think I'm green, which was more like listener and I didn't say quiet. I can't bring it up right. I had a screenshot. I can't find it, but I was going to look at it. But it does like the red, I think you mentioned the personality that's more direct and that kind of thing. So it's very interesting. Everyone, I'll make sure that you'll see it on the Pencil Link or Ink website. So we'll make sure we link to that so you can check that out.
Yeah, it sounds like your top color is green. And that doesn't mean like, even though maybe red, which is what you were mentioning, the kind of decisive, forceful side of you, you still have that. And probably you can think of some times where you've had to use it, but it just isn't at the surface for you. And I think it's just good to be reminded it's there, but green is more my comfort zone.
Green leads, exactly. Yes. I think once you said that, because I was thinking just one color, but once you started talking about it more, it is that the other colors are there. They're just different positions.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Now, your agency has worked with large brands like Google and Marriott and Starbucks. So for all the consultants listening, what would you say has been a key factor for you in helping to grow your business and work with such big clients, even though I know you work with small businesses also?
I would say with all of them, large and small, it's all about relationships. I think a lot of people, partly because sales feels like a kind of unnatural interaction for a lot of people, whatever their personality type. Everyone has a part of the sales process that they're probably less comfortable with. I think that's fair to say. I think sometimes people try and forge a connection where there isn't one. For example, they might look at someone's LinkedIn profile, which isn't a bad thing to do. I would say definitely do that in a sales context, but how you use it is important. So I think some people might step outside their comfort zone and say, I see you went to such and such a college. Well, actually, I spent a year there. Let's talk about that. But that doesn't mean that the person's going to want to work with you. And they might be a little creeped out that you looked them up.
Right, that you've been stalking them, right?
Right. It might make the small talk a little easier, but it doesn't mean that you forged a relationship with that person. And I think one skill that you mentioned earlier, I'd come back to in the context of sales, is being a good listener. Those other things that we were covering, like showing respect for people's time, especially in a sales context, people love that. And I'd also build on the kind of relationships angle and just say, so many of us have so many contacts, and I will come back to LinkedIn because I'd imagine pretty much all of your listeners use it. And we have so many contacts in there, so many connections, but how many of them are real connections? Often if you go back and send someone you met many years ago a message and say, hey, here's what I'm up to now. And you're not asking to sell them something there and then, because the chances are they'll ignore it. But you're saying, here, I started a business. This is what I do. What's going on in your world? I remember last time we spoke, you were starting a family, or maybe you don't remember what was going on with them and you just want to ask. And then perhaps, for me, if they're in New York City, I might say, let's get a cup of coffee or jump on the phone. Often those little sparks, those little connections, when you've taken a moment to reach back out to someone, are the ones that really move forward, and the ones where they say, oh, actually, it looks like you're doing this. I'd love to hear about your business. And sometimes they'll be the ones who start to talk about working together. But just because you've shown this interest in them and maintained that relationship, that's where the really kind of lucrative connections come in. And I think that's a definite differentiator for me.
That's excellent. Thank you. That's great advice. And I think for people listening too, to remember to, well, of course, I'm going to say this, right? Think about how you can support the other person if possible. All about support.
Yeah.
But, to your point of asking, what are you doing now? Or let's get together so I can hear about what you're doing. And it's not just a pitch of, hey, this is what I'm up to and what I'm doing. Let me know if you can help me. Even if someone doesn't say that explicitly, sometimes, again, communications, sometimes that might be how it comes across, right?
Yeah, it's not just one-sided. I think a lot of people kind of overthink and I'm a textbook overthinker myself, so I get it. But I think a lot of us kind of overthink these interactions as, oh, I've got to get the business. Or even if you're using LinkedIn and your connections to try and get a job somewhere, I think often we think, oh, I better have just the perfect 2-paragraph note where I've said all the right things. When actually a lighter touch, a shorter note is almost always better.
A lighter touch. And you are just full of the quotes today, Ellie. I gotta write that down.
Excellent. I need to get these into my Twitter feed.
Yes,
I should be taking notes.
Yes, exactly. I'll send them to you. That's excellent. So what would you say helped you, just going back just a little bit from when you said when you were younger, you feel like you were shy growing up? What would you say transformed in you, if anything? Maybe you still feel like you're shy, but that allowed you to, interestingly enough, go into the business of communications, having been a shy person? Is this just another part of you, as you mentioned, the personalities, another side of you that has come out, or did it evolve over time?
I think it's a little bit of all of those things. So I'm still shy, and I still have my shy moments, and I've been with my husband for about 6 years, and it still sometimes amazes him when I have my shy moments, especially given what my day job is. But I think I learned, and I think this is especially important for women, but I kind of learned not to be apologetic for also being ambitious and to sort of harness my confidence. I remember in one of my very first jobs, I had a performance review with my boss, and I felt like things were going well. And they probably could have been going better, but you know what it's like very early in your career when you kind of, you maybe don't see the nuances that looking back were always there.
Right.
But he told me that I'd been doing really well and everybody really liked me and they were very happy with my work. And he felt like he could trust me to do a lot more things and was able to pass off more than he'd ever kind of envisioned. And then he said, but you're really too confident. And I remember just being devastated. And first of all, thinking, well, I'm so shy. Like that doesn't even sound like me. And looking back, I mean, at the time I was crying, like I was telling all my friends about it, like the way you kind of flail when things don't go right, especially when maybe not everyone's like this, I shouldn't tar them with the same brush, but like early on, it was the worst thing I could hear. And looking back, I think, well, you know what, there were plenty of overconfident men in that company, but they were never coached to be less confident. And also, as a leadership consultant, I know that when you give someone feedback, you've got to give them something actionable and tie it to, the business and getting things done and the person's career. And to me, this was none of those things. But at the time, I didn't have the vocabulary for it. I didn't understand it. It just made me really sad. And, I was devastated. And then many years later, looking back, I was thinking, wait a minute, actually, maybe it is okay to be confident. And it took me a while to recover from that professionally. But I think, kind of getting back to your question, I learned a lot of skills. Like I went into an agency job where they did a lot of the work that I do now and taught me so much, led by an amazing woman, Maureen Taylor. This company that I worked for, I knew that I wanted to do a lot of the things that they offered that were very kind of confident things, if you will. So, teaching a room full of people presentation skills, coaching executives at Google and all these other interesting places. But I knew that I also had to get better. So I played to my strengths. Like I was always a very academic person. I studied. I learned up everything. I got all the theory down. And sometimes I'm good at winging it, but most of the time I kind of need to prepare. So I played to that strength. And 2 great bits of advice I got while I was in that role really helped me. One, when I was, kind of prepping to give my first presentation skills class after having been trained for so long, and I was kind of getting impatient just to get up there and do it. But the first one I was doing was a room full of senior execs at Oracle who were part of this very prestigious leadership course. They'd been at the company 20 years. Needless to say, they were a few decades older than I was. I was very self-conscious and shy. But the two pieces of advice I got were, number one, good communication skills work. And if you have conviction in those, then the rest sort of falls into place. And I thought, well, that's so instructive because I'm teaching these people these skills, so I should be able to own them myself. And the other thing, and perhaps the more useful thing, the night before this class, because there were a whole team of us going, because there were multiple classes happening at the same time, and it was down in DC, so we'd all traveled overnight. The night before at the bar, one of my other colleagues said, he said, you're kind of a wise ass. And I was almost about to apologize. He said, no, you're really funny. He was like, you need to bring that with you when you're in front of that room. And it was great. Like, it gave me permission to be myself. Mm-hmm. It also, I think, undid a lot of the damage that early boss had done by telling me I was too competent, or that, essentially that guy had said that my personality was a problem, whereas this guy was saying it's a strength, like, use it. But it also made me feel, and I think this is important, I wasn't playing a part. I'm not being an actor or an actress in front of a room. I'm using these good skills to amplify what's already there. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm doing with my clients. So it was really, really helpful to have that bit of advice and that bit of coaching, and to use the skills that I lean on. And actually, I think in some ways it's a strength to be fairly introverted and shy when you're coaching people to be the opposite, because it means you have more authenticity. Like, if these things came really easy to me, I'm sure there'd be other things that I'd have to work at more, but it would probably be harder for me to have that empathy with my clients. Whereas I can say, I know you're nervous and I know you're shy. I know on some level you'd rather be sitting at the back of the room, but here's why and how you could really own it.
Mm-hmm. That empathy again comes in there.
That's right. Yeah.
And I love that you said, thank you for sharing all that. I love that you said too about this permission to be yourself, which is what I think we're all looking for. But just that conversation with your colleague at that time, it was sort of like, oh yeah, damn, I am funny. I am going to let that show,
Yes.
Things that sometimes we don't even, again, we don't think about ourselves, whether it's skills or personality. So I'm glad it came full circle for you of being more of yourself instead of playing small.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we can talk about this all day, and I'm sure we will, but like this idea that women do need to be given that permission sometimes. And one thing that I've been reading a lot about lately, and I've heard little snippets of on your podcast and in other places, especially at the moment, is this idea of authenticity in the workplace, and how, for years, maybe the last 5 years, people have been talking about that, and tech companies have been big into it. And they even occasionally bring in people like me to talk about telling your personal story and showing vulnerability. And I think it is incredibly important to be authentic, but at the same time, I think we need to think about the world as it is and the world how we want it to be. And of course, at my company, authenticity rules, and you can be whoever you want to be and whoever you are, and you don't have to worry too much about, let me give you some examples, because I feel like I'm talking very theoretically at the moment. But one thing that I hear is sometimes as women, and I talk about, this with my clients because they work in different companies and in bigger firms, sometimes more traditional ones, they say, we're told to be authentic, but my authentic self is to be very authoritative. And when I am that way, I'm told that I'm aggressive or that I'm a bitch, and like all these things that for men, it's such an old example, but they're, told that they're being authoritative and professional, whereas we are told that we're being just the opposite. And I think to bear that in mind, this idea of we do need permission to be ourselves sometimes, but often we also need the workplace culture that will reward us for that rather than punish us.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now, what would you say entrepreneurship has taught you about yourself as a woman?
I think it has taught me that I am capable of more than I realized I was capable of, but also to, since we're talking so much about gender, I think it's taught me to recognize that there are so many women out there doing great things and that we can help each other. I think this podcast is a great example of that. There are also women's networking groups and support groups, and I'm part of one or two of those. And it's just so inspiring to see what we are capable of and how we can build up ourselves, but also build up each other and help each other. And I'm sure you will agree, this idea of being able to support each other is so fundamental, because we do have a lot of obstacles that men don't have, whether it's, being the ones to bear the children, to come back to the example we were talking about earlier, or just this idea of how we're perceived and that playing out differently for different genders as well. So it's been hugely instructive about myself, but also about women in general.
I think too, something I love about your story, there are many things, of course, but also the fact that throughout your story, you mentioned these moments where you are part of a group or some kind of support system within your journey that helped you evolve in different ways, whether it was the mommy group or the groups that you're a part of now as an entrepreneur. It just seems like it's been an important part of your journey. So everyone catch that. It's not just me preaching this. There's a reason to get this support and get around other women and people who will support you in whatever way.
Absolutely. Yes. I think it's so important to have those people to talk to, especially when I think for most of us, when we start out, we're on our own. Maybe we have a business partner, but still it can get pretty lonely. And
It's
I
so
think,
lonely.
yes, I think the more you recognize that you're not alone, if you know where to look, and even, I mean, of course, I'm in New York City. City is saturated with opportunities for networking and the like. But even if you're somewhere that's, less saturated, or you feel like there isn't as much, a lot of these networks are online.
Mm-hmm.
You can download a podcast anywhere, but also the kind of more practical tools out there can reach you via the internet. And I think that's a good thing to bear in mind. And also, people like me, and I think a lot of female executives, never dislike getting an email from someone, a woman who's starting their own business, saying, hey, I'd love to jump on the phone or jump on FaceTime and chat to you. So don't be shy about that sort of thing. Like, worst case, the person won't answer your email, and that's probably just because they're busy. So definitely try and get in touch with other women entrepreneurs and talk to them. I think we can really help each other out.
That's great advice. Excellent. Don't everybody, overwhelm Ellie with emails, but she did say if you reach out, just in case you decide to. So in closing, Ellie, if you think over your life and career and you had the chance to thank only one person whose support was critical to you personally or professionally, who would that be and what would you say?
Wow. I mean, it really does take a village. So I feel a little bit bad singling someone out. I would say in the most immediate sense, I would thank my partner, my husband, just because I was at a really low ebb after I had my daughter. And it's one of these for any of the moms out there, like parenthood is full of so many contradictions. Like, I was both the happiest I've ever been, but also I was depressed. And I think a lot of women suffer from postpartum depression. And it was my husband. And, to an extent, it was also the support group at Love Child, the yoga place that I mentioned, and various other women in my life who were there for me. But he was the one who said, the way he put it was so diplomatic. He said something like, I feel like you're not as happy at the moment as you could be. And that was just a very nice way of saying, I can tell that you're depressed, but if I tell you you're depressed, it may make you cry.
Right.
And that made, I think, the biggest difference to me. And that's not something I open up about very much, but I do think it's important to talk about. And if it hadn't been for the other, now I'm sort of cheating and naming a bunch of other people, but if it hadn't been for the other women I'd met through kind of the Mommy Network and those different groups talking about postpartum depression, or talking about how hard it is to both be an ambitious career woman, but also to know that sometimes you have to take your foot off the gas, then I probably still wouldn't have felt fully comfortable getting help and telling people that I needed it. So I want to pay it forward a bit and just let anyone out there who's in a similar position know that you can get help and it does get better. And look, and now I want to have more kids. Like there's so much about a journey that you learn from, whether it's entrepreneurship or parenthood. And those two things are actually quite similar in a lot of ways in terms of ups and downs.
I think too, thank you for sharing that. I think too, not to have, as you mentioned, just being unapologetic about being ambitious, but then also not being ashamed, I think, of having those feelings, whether it's postpartum depression or just going through a low point. Both things can be a part of you and you can get help figuring out both.
Exactly. Yeah, well said.
What would you say now are the ways that we can support you? Of course, I'll have a link to the website and all your fabulous quotes, but tell everyone where they can get in touch with you. If you want to share your email, no pressure, but your website certainly and social media.
Thank you. Yes. So people can find me at pencilorinc.com. That's pencilorink.com. There is a little bit more information about me, but also about the company and my team and what we do. There's also a contact form in there. We always love to hear from people who just want to talk. I mean, if you want to work with us, fantastic. But also, if you ever just want to have a cup of coffee, if you're in New York, or jump on FaceTime, it may not be this week, but in the coming months, I will get through everyone. Also, a more immediate way to reach us is on our social media channels. We're at Pencil or Ink on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and we are always glad to connect with people. And as I say, And as Elaine says, so much of this is about being a part of a community, and it does take a village. We will absolutely follow back you and your business on all our channels because we just love connecting with other companies too.
And she's pencil or ink because she got all those domains early on. It's all about branding, everyone. Make sure it's all the same. That's good. Ellie, thank you so much. This was so fun. It was great to have a conversation with another editor, communications person, and just ask these questions and just see what you've been able to create with your business. It's very inspiring. So I'm very happy to be able to connect with you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. And thank you for doing what you do. And I feel like we should have another podcast where someone interviews you because I love the look of your website and what you're doing.
Thank you. Excellent. Now, before you go, what's a parting piece of advice from you to our listeners about anything?
I would say put relationships first, and let me break that down into more sort of practical nuggets.
Mm-hmm.
One is, when you work with someone, whether they're a paying customer or you're just doing a little bit of free work early on to get something into your portfolio, always follow up with a thank you note. If it's handwritten, even better. People love that. But just having that sort of human approach, even if you just, have a cup of coffee with someone or do an informational interview, making sure that you follow up. It takes 2 minutes. That can make all the difference. It's kind of the difference between people remembering you, people making referrals for you later. Often it's those sort of almost like an afterthought, those little asides that maybe we don't think too much about at the time that people later respond to, maybe 6 months or a year later. But those are the ones that can often lead to business. But even if it doesn't, it's just a nice thing to do.
Excellent. Ellie, thank you so much. Hold on for just a second.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ellie. To find out more about her, to find out more about Pencil or Ink, and to get more information of how to get in touch with her, make sure you go to supportissexypodcast.com. That's supportissexypodcast.com. Go to that search icon at the top and just type in Ellie, Ellie. Her show notes page will pop up with all of the links and the resources, and again, the ways to get in touch with her. Supportissexypodcast.com and just type in Ellie. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. At least I hope you do. I truly appreciate you. As I always say, it wouldn't be the same without you. Now, until we chat again next time, always remember that you deserve support. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care.